Well, this week, as we look at the heroes of faith from Hebrews chapter 11, we're going to look at Abraham and Sarah, two prominent figures in the book of Genesis in the Old Testament, people called by God to follow him faithfully. Last week, we looked at Noah, and we saw how Noah was faithful to the task God had given them. This week, we're going to see how Abraham and Sarah have faith to believe in God, even though it might not make sense. They believe, they look forward to a future reality that yet has not yet begun to take shape in their lives. We hear about and piece together the story of Abraham and his family in the book of Genesis, and we see that Abraham's family, his father and his brothers, are called to leave the land of Ur. The Bible says this is in the land of the Chaldeans. It's in modern-day Iraq, near the southeastern end of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. There in the Fertile Crescent, near where ancient Babylon would have been. And God calls them to leave that place. He calls them from, frankly, the Bible tells us, from a life of serving idols just like the people around them did. And he calls them to faithfully follow and worship the true God. And so they begin heading northwest along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers and end up in the northern end of that area of land in the Fertile Crescent, what's in a city that's called Haran. It's there that Abraham is called by God to leave his family and go to a land he does not know. He doesn't know what the land's going to look like. He doesn't know how God's going to give it to him, deliver it to him. But yet Abraham goes on faith. He takes his wife Sarah with him. He takes his nephew Lot and Lot's wife and their possessions with them as well. God has blessed them immensely with great flocks and herds, and they go to the land of Canaan. It's there that God promises to Abraham that this land will one day be his descendants. It's interesting, this land is populated by others. There's already people living in this land, but yet God tells Abraham, this land will be your descendants. Abraham doesn't see that reality. In fact, the only piece of it that he can ever claim as his own is just a little field with a cave in it that he bought so that they could bury their loved ones there. Lot and Abraham, they eventually separate because of a dispute over pasture lands for their flocks and herds. Abraham still doesn't have his own descendant. So that was one of the things God promised. Besides land, he promised them descendants. And in fact, not just descendants, but nations, established peoples. So to live in this land that God had promised. So he promised them land, he promised them descendants and nations that would come from him. The third thing that God promises is that God would bless Abraham, and that by blessing Abraham and his descendants, the whole world would be blessed through them. Now, this promise is supposed to happen through the descendants and the nation of Israel, but it doesn't fully and finally take place until Jesus comes, this one descendant of Abraham, who through his death and resurrection causes the entire world to be blessed. But we're still back with Abraham and Sarah. They're getting old. Sarah's past the age of childbearing, and they have no descendants, no children. They're wondering how God can possibly make this happen. Many nations, as numerous as the stars in the sky or the sand on the seashore. And so they see this future, they believe this future, but they're not sure how it's going to come about. And so Abraham and Sarah take it upon themselves. And Sarah gives Abraham her maidservant to sleep with. And Hagar, this maidservant, becomes pregnant and bears a son named Ishmael. Ishmael is a strong man, it seems like, and has many descendants. But God says that this is not how or who will bear the blessing that I want to give. And so throughout the rest of the account between Isaac, the son of promise that later comes, the Israelites, the people of God, and Ishmael, they're at conflict with one another. And that continues to this day, as many of the Arab Arab people are descendants of Ishmael. So that conflict started and continued in the biblical times and still goes to this day. But we're still left with Abraham and Sarah not having a child of their own. And so God comes to them again, and Abraham is 99 years old and says that this time next year, Sarah will have a son. And it must have been difficult for Sarah and Abraham to believe this. Sarah laughs. Now, whether that's out of exasperation or disbelief or doubt, Hebrews actually tells us that Sarah trusts and believes God. The book of Hebrews tells us that. And a year later, through the work of God, Sarah, who is past the age of childbearing, has a son. Abraham and Sarah are considered heroes of faith, not because they got everything right or because they always trusted in God, but because they saw the future that had not yet happened. They saw the future clearly because of what God had told them. They believed God. They believed in this future that he promised, and that was counted to them as righteousness through faith. They were righteous because they believed that future that God had promised to them. May the same be true for us, that we can believe and trust in the future that God has declared and shown to us through Jesus Christ. God's blessings on your continued study.